Aloha and welcome to this screencast on Meteor Application Template React. This is the third screencast, and what we want to do in this one is go over the user interface to the system and how that's implemented in terms of React components and so forth. So the interface, once you've logged in this case I've logged in as the admin, there's basically 4 pages. There's this landing page, and there is a page to add an item to the database. There's a page to list the items in the database associated with this particular user, and then if you happen to have the admin role, which this user has, then you get a special page called admin where you get to find out all of the items in the database in the list, in the stuff collection, regardless of who the owner is. Okay, so let's see how that actually gets implemented. And as you know, in Meteor, if we kind of take a look at the top level folder structure, there's distinguished directories, and this can be changed in Meteor, but by default you have 2 directories, a client and a server directory. And the contents of the client directory are loaded in each client when each client starts up, and when the system starts up, the contents of the server folder are loaded, or more specifically the main.js file in there is loaded. And so since we're looking at the user interface, we're going to be looking at the client side code for the most part. And so mains.js consists of 2 import statements. We're going to import this file from the import startup directory, and so this gets into kind of the Meteor best practice for directory structure implementation. The idea is that the client and server directories are eagerly loaded, but there's very little in them, because you don't want to necessarily load your entire system, entire client-side code or server-side code at once. So instead what you do is you use import statements to kind of conditionally load things just as you require them. And so in the imports directory, we have an API directory by convention, which kind of holds the data model, your database or Mongo collection definitions and schemas and so forth. A startup folder, which is going to contain the code that gets loaded on either the client or server side when you start up, and then you have a UI directory where you basically define your React components to specify how the pages look. So that's the structure of things. So what we're going to do here is we're going to load the startup as well as this style.css file. So let's go into import startup client, and there's our startup.jsx page. And what you can see here is that this is pretty much your standard way in Meteor and in React for that matter to kind of start things up. You have this top level component called the app component, and then you're going to attach it to the element in your page, which has the element ID root. So if we look at main.html, which is going to be loaded, you can see here's our little div that has the ID root. So we're going to replace that by the app component. Okay. So the app component is located in the UI directory under the layouts page. All right, so under the layouts directory. And so the standard way that you organize stuff, one standard way to organize stuff, the great thing about standards is there's so many of them. So one standard way to organize the user interface directory is into 3 components. One is layouts, which basically is going to have 1 or more components that specify the kind of the global structure of pages. In many cases, probably for you guys, most all the time, you'll just have a single layout. And then we have kind of going down one step from the global layout, we have a set of pages. And then when you have things that appear in multiple pages or tiny pieces of a single page, you put that into the components directory. So let's look at this app React component. And what you can see here is that the app component, which is basically our entire application layout, is going to consist of a nav bar at the top of the page, a footer React component at the bottom of each page, of every page, and then in the middle we'll have different stuff between the nav bar and the footer, which is really a fairly standard canonical web application layout style. And this middle part is using the React router switch component to specify that what appears in the middle of each page is going to be dependent upon what the URL is. Okay, and so you can see a bunch of different path specifications, and then you can see that depending on what which path specification matches, we go to these different components, and it turns out that all of these components are defined in the pages directory, which of course makes sense logically, because that's kind of how we're defining the structure. Okay, so let me see if there's anything. Oh yeah, so the other part of this code, which is kind of interesting, and this is fairly boilerplate code from the React router, which is how do you ensure that that certain pages can only be seen by certain users with certain kinds of credentials. And this is whether they click on a button or they type the URL in manually, doesn't really matter. And so you can define these things called protected. I define a protected route function, or basically take the code from the React router example and show that what we can do is check to make sure that if they want to go to a protected route, they basically have to be logged in first. All right, so that's what that means. And otherwise, they're going to be sent to the sign-in page. The admin protected route says not only do they have to be logged in, but they have to have the role admin. And if that's both of those things are true, then they get to see the page. Otherwise, they go to the sign-in page. And you can see here that basically anybody can go to the landing page, anyone can go to the sign-in, anyone can go to the sign-up, but you have to be logged in as a user in order to go to the list page or the add page. And you have to be, furthermore, you have to, or the edit page. Furthermore, you have to be an actual admin to go to the admin page, list stuff admin page, and finally to be able to go to do sign out, you have to be logged in. So that's how that all works. So let's take a look at some of these pages. We can start with the landing page, which is a pretty simple page. And let me see if I can get back there. So here's the landing page. What that looks like when it's rendered, and this is what the code looks like. We've got these semantic UI components, grid and image. So we got a grid, there's a vertical alignment of being centered, and there's a container, so there's some padding on the sides, except when the thing gets small and then the padding goes away. And then we have two columns that have the Meteor logo and a little bit of text. Okay, so that kind of ends up looking like this. The nav bar is above, the footer is below, and this stuff is in the middle. So that's super simple. Getting a little more complicated, we could try looking at the list stuff page. So if we go there and click list stuff, this is a page that's got the nav bar at the top, the footer at the bottom, and in the middle we've got this title and we've got a table. So how do we do that? So this is an interesting page. In that, well, let's just start with, how do we actually render this? It's really simple, right? We'll have this top-level semantic UI container. There'll be a header inside that's centered, and then we'll have a semantic UI table that's got cells. Here's the header row. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get the contents of, we're going to have an array of objects where each object has fields corresponding to the fields in a stuff item in the collection. And I'll show how that happens in a second. But basically, to lay it out, what we're going to do is we're going to call map with a function, and the function is going to take an individual object, JavaScript object, containing data for each of the fields in a stuff collection, and we're going to call the stuff item React component from the components directory to actually render each row in the table. So as you know, in React, when you're rendering a bunch of components of the same type, you need to supply a key value so that React can do kind of intelligent updating of the DOM, because it now knows it has a unique ID for each of these objects of the same type. So we're just going to use the doc ID because that's a convenient way to find a unique value for each of these elements, and re-render them if that particular ID, the contents of the document associated with that ID changes. And then we'll pass in the object that contains the actual key values. So let's look at stuff item from the components directory right now, and you can see we're going to get this stuff item, and we'll render it as a semantic UI row object within a table, and then we have a cell object within the row, and we just render the name, quantity, condition fields from this stuff object, which is being passed in. And then we want to also have a link. So if we go here, you can see there's an actual link here to another page where you can edit that item. So if I click that, you can see we go here. But the way that's implemented is by this link semantic UI, this link component from the React router package, where we supply the text that's the URL, and then the value, and then to make this work correctly, we have to wrap this component, or we have to use the with router higher order component, which is going to be passed a component, and then returns a new component, which is returned as kind of the stuff item component, but it's now wrapped with additional information that makes this link stuff work correctly within React router. So that's stuff item, and so that's how we actually render all these. We render this table. Okay, so the thing that's missing is, well, how do we get the data out of the database so that we can actually invoke these things and get them rendered? Okay, and here's where we get to a really standard design pattern in Meteor for dealing with React, and it's called with tracker, and it's called a higher order component. And the syntax for this, and actually even the way, it's, if you just look at this and you're not comfortable with functional programming, it's going to look really hard, like, is that even JavaScript? Because what's happening is you have with tracker, and that is a function, and it's being passed another function, okay, which is right here, which contains some code. And then you've got some more parentheses and your actual React component. So what's happening here conceptually is with tracker is a function that accepts a function that enables you to specify Meteor-related stuff related to subscribing to the database and indicating what the component actually needs from the database after you subscribe to it. So with tracker is passed a function. And what with tracker returns is a new function that takes one argument. And the argument that new function takes is your list stuff component that you've defined up here. And then the result of invoking that function, which was returned from with tracker on a React component, is a new React component. Okay, and that's what's actually exported by default from this page. And so when you're doing the import later on, that's what you're getting. You're getting now a React component which starts off from this specification and is augmented with the property values that should be returned, as well as the ability to subscribe and kind of reactively re-render when the values of objects that result from the subscription change. Okay, so it gives it that real-time reactivity that Meteor likes within the React framework. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, it's not terrible. You just have to realize that what you want to use this code and kind of edit this stuff appropriately, and of course edit this appropriately so that you're returning the right component. And what you get is a React component that understands Meteor and is going to do the right thing when underlying data changes. Okay. So anyway, long story short, right? In Meteor, we have this pub-sub model. We have publications and subscriptions. The publications are specified in the imports startup server directory. Here they are. Okay, and so we're going to find two publications. One called Stuff, which is going to return all of the items, all of the documents in the Stuffs collection whose owner field matches the currently logged in user. Okay, that's one publication. There's another publication which is called Stuff Admin, and that's going to return all of the documents in the Stuffs collection, but it will only do that when you're not only logged in, but you have the admin role, the logged in user. Okay. So those are our two publications which specify what kinds of data from the server database will be replicated into the Minimongo database on the client side. And so what that means is we're going to subscribe to the Stuff collection here, which says populate my Minimongo database with all of the documents in the Stuff collection associated with this specific user. And then what we'll do is we'll say we want a property called Stuffs that can be accessed by this component, which consists of all of the documents in our local Minimongo database that have been populated due to this subscription. And then we have this other kind of design pattern called a ready prop, which returns the value of subscription.ready. Okay, so the deal here is that when you're subscribed, let's say you're subscribing to 1,000 elements or something, or you have a bunch of different subscriptions here. That could take a few seconds to actually go to the server and get the data and populate the Minimongo database. And so during that time where it's trying to get the data from the database but hasn't finished, this ready function is available to and will return false if the subscription process has not completed yet. It'll return true when it has completed. So we create this ready property, which is going to have the value of this ready function return value. And our render method is now very simple. It's going to say, listen, if this ready property is false, what we're going to do is we're going to display a loading icon. So that's like a little spinner kind of thing with some text saying we're getting data. But and then this is kind of the beauty of this with tracker thing is that it's going to ensure that whenever any of these values change, it's going to kind of keep periodically re-invoking these things. And when these values change, it's going to tell React it needs to re-render the page. So it's kind of as if by magic, this render will be periodically redone if any of these property values have changed, which means that when this .props.ready is finally true, then we'll actually invoke the render page, and that will actually render our table. Now this .prop.stuffs is kind of guaranteed to have the values from the collection that we need. So now we can map over them and do all that stuff. Okay, so that's how that works. The add stuff page, okay, which looks like this. It's a simple form, what that consists of is a form schema that we'll use in combination with the uniforms package to lay out that form using semantic UI components. I'm not going to go over this in detail here. I'm going to have a whole separate screencast just dealing with form processing. So I'm just going to kind of say that page exists. Similarly, we can go, if we go to list stuff and click edit, we get to the edit stuff page, which is here. And again, we're using uniforms to create a page that allows you to edit an existing item. And I'm going to go through that. That's like 10 minutes of explanation right there, so I'm not going to do it here, just to note that these two pages are here. We've also got the kind of the sign in, and that's kind of an interesting page when we get to forms, because you'll notice here we're not using uniforms for the sign in page. We're using the kind of the low level design pattern for handling forms in React. And it's kind of interesting to look through this and compare it with the use of uniforms, because you can see that there's uniforms is pretty nice. It abstracts away some of this boilerplate for you. What else do we have? We have this stuff item admin page. Looks like this. And if you go look at the component here, you can see it's pretty much just like the stuff item, except that instead of having a link to edit, we include a column in which we're specifying the owner of the page. Okay, and then here's the top level page. That was the component. Here's the top level page, and we're going to go through basically the same stuff, except here we're subscribing to stuff admin, and that's only going to actually return values or populate the mini Mongo database in the case that the logged in user has role admin. And that should always be the case by virtue of the fact, well, you could try, for example, just typing in this URL, and if you're not the admin user, you won't see anything. It's not going to return any values because you don't have the admin role. On the other hand, in most cases, you don't try typing this in manually. You're clicking on this link, and that link is only displayed when you're actually an admin user. Okay, so in the case that you are an admin user, you can click this link, you're going to get the data. In the case that you aren't an admin user, you won't see this link up here, and even if you type this in by hand, you're not going to get the data. All right, that I think is a pretty good overview of how the user interface works. Hope you enjoy that, and see you next time.